There's a line from Cornel West. You may know Cornel West, a great thinker and I would say sort of a modern-day prophet in the tradition of critiquing the powers that be. There's a line he has that's been stuck in my mind ever since I first heard it a number of years ago. It's this: justice is what love looks like in public. Justice is what love looks like in public. He has said this in many times and places now, and I think he's building upon earlier people's ideas about this. It's not that it arrived out of nowhere, certainly, but the first time I heard it was when he spoke to the UUA's General Assembly in 2015. Now, to be clear, I don't always agree with West. I don't actually know anyone who is. He's quite a controversial figure at times. If you don't disagree with him on something, you haven't paid attention enough. But for instance, I'm not really sure why he's running for president or why he started a new political party called Justice for All recently. Because I think, in fact, that he would not be a very good president. And I'm guessing this new party will not last long. And as I said to start this, I think he's much better as an outside voice in the tradition of those prophets, critiquing those in power. That's kind of beside the point, though, today. I just wanted to give some context about West. He's also been a prominent academic, a public intellectual for several decades now. But to go back to that line that just sticks in my mind, justice is what love looks like in public. I think in this he's made a very powerful observation about a number of things and packed it into just a few words, which is really impressive. I think it's an observation about the way we use and overuse the word love. This is the third of my three-part series about love, sermon series here. We often use the word love without giving any real context for what we mean by it. And in English, love has a lot of interrelated and overlapping definitions. I think West is providing a powerful extension to what the Apostle Paul said in his letter to the Corinthians, which I referenced this a couple sermons ago too. Paul says, "If I speak in the tongues of men or of angels but do not have love, I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal." I think in West's quote, he's extending this to if we merely talk about love without ensuring justice, then we're essentially doing the same thing, merely being noisy instruments with no real meaning. And if I'm correct about what he means by that, I think I am, I find this to be a devastating critique of many of our politicians and religious leaders and popular celebrities who are quick with affirmations of love, promises of prayer, compassion for humanity, but very, very slow on any real justice-making efforts behind those words. All right, so I've outlaid a few ways that I think this quote is very powerful, so let's get into it a little more. Part of what West does in this quote is to nod to the systemic approach to the idea of good and evil and love and justice. I'm going to make some generalities here, and someone's going to tell me that I'm wrong, and I think I'm wrong in specific instances, but not about the bigger picture. So let's see. I argue that all people, have a very hard time understanding things on a very large scale level. We are wired by biology and history to think in relatively small terms. We think about our family. We think about the people that we know and see often. We think in stories, not statistics. And this is a part of why many people have a hard time understanding what we call systemic oppression. Because a lot of people know, or at least think, that they are not personally racist or homophobic or any of the other oppressive stances we might name. And furthermore, that they have never or rarely seen specific and clear instances of those oppressions. Now, whether they've been willfully ignorant of these is a whole nother discussion. But I think this is true, that their feelings about it are true, that is. And given this, they struggle to understand that even if something is not a part of their own experience, it's a real and widespread thing. So showing people statistics and studies to prove them wrong is very, very ineffective. Because those statistics, those studies will never mean more to them than their own experience and the stories they have told themselves about those experiences. The interesting thing that it's not just oppression that works that way, it's also love. After all, it's easy, well, relatively easy, to love one person. It's relatively easy to love a few people, like your closest friends and family. But I think it's actually very hard to love, to even know what that means, to love a country or a planet or our world or humanity in general. It's very abstract. Those are hard because it's hard to know what that even really means. We can say words about those things, we can talk about them, but I don't know that we really feel or understand them most of the time. It's not impossible to do this. I'm just saying it's more difficult for us to do so in a meaningful way. It's one reason I'm skeptical of, say, patriotic claims of love. What does it mean to love one's country? It's certainly a convenient thing to say. It's a thing often said. It's sort of hard to argue with. No, you don't love your country. I mean, you can say that, I suppose, but I'm always curious what someone means when they say they love America. After all, some of the things that pop up in my mind are, do you love its history? Do you love the history riddled with slavery and legal oppression and wars and poverty and the systemic erasure of most of the native population? Do you love its legal system, which has some good points, sure, but I find problematic in many ways too? Do you love our culture, and what do you mean by our culture? Our is a very loaded word there, I think. Or, and here's where I really get to it, I think. When you say you love your country, do you love the status quo that privileges people who are like you? I often find this last one is really the one that some people mean, but they either can't or won't admit that. And this is, of course, related to things like the Make America Great Again claims. Because I always want to ask, what exactly is it you want to make great again? Which parts? When were they great? And for whom was it great? Not everyone, surely. But I imagine for people who are like the person saying that. So, to get back to our quote from West again, to say that justice is what love looks like in public, that's very powerful, but I think it's also a little vague. West expands upon this quite a bit, by the way. It's easy to say things like you love your country, or even you love your neighbor. It's harder to say you love a specific neighbor, in my opinion, but love your neighbor in writ large. It's easy to say things like you love your country or you love your neighbor and simultaneously ignore that they are experiencing systemic injustice. It's quite easy to do this. In the greatest extreme, this looks like slave owners 200 years ago who might talk about how much they loved their slaves, how slaves were almost like their family, and never see a contradiction between that and literally holding people hostage for life in brutal conditions. We could go on and on. In a perhaps more relatable example to many of us, it can mean things like providing charitable help to people in need without ever doing anything about the systemic conditions that lead to that need. I am so amazed and full of love and impressed by the work we do in this congregation to help people with food and clothing and shelter. But I'm more impressed when we do real work on making legal and societal and systemic change so that people don't have to experience those needs in the first place. And that's a lot harder in my experience. We do both of those things here, however imperfectly. But I always like to point out the difference and emphasize that they are both good and both necessary. There's the old story about this. If you see a baby floating down the river in a basket by itself, you jump in and you get the baby out. If you see a baby like that in the river every day, then you need to go upstream and stop whatever is happening to put babies in the river in the first place. Another way to say this is that love is adequate but not necessary. Necessary but not adequate. Love is not enough. Love without structure and without guidelines, without something like what we mean when we say justice, is just empty words and feelings signifying nothing. We have to have structure, and this is what laws and social welfare nets, however imperfect they are, and they really are imperfect, but they're about putting love into action. As I talked about with our children this morning, we might call this fairness or equity or compassion, but I think love works too. We need organizations and structures and rules and guidelines that help us to be loving, not merely to feel loving. My wife, the Reverend Schmidt, also a Unitarian Universalist minister who will be preaching here next month, actually, so come check her out. She gives the same homily at every wedding she officiates, and she has no problem with me saying that, don't worry. The wedding service has a lot of personal touches when she does it, but the central message is the same to every couple that she marries. I'm going to paraphrase. She says that love is not just an emotion, it's a practice. Because there will be times when you are not feeling loving towards your spouse. There will be times when you don't even like them. Times when you are mad at them, when you may not be able to stand them even. I've been there. And she goes on, though. Don't worry, that's not the end of it. She says, this is why it's important not to stake the success of your marriage on feeling loving towards one another all the time, because you will not. Instead, she says, you have to practice love. You have to work on being loving. You have to work on things like communicating, on building a foundation of your marriage and relationship, and this doesn't apply just to marriages, but it's a convenient example, on building that foundation that has a lot more going for it than just your current emotion. Because on your wedding day, you probably feel exceedingly loving towards your spouse. It will not always be that way, and if you want to be successful, you need more than just that. However imperfect this metaphor is, so it is with us and the world too. So it is with each of us and our fellow humans. If we're going to feel loving towards humanity, we have to reckon with people who will sometimes disappoint and anger and disgust us. We have to reckon with being in situations that make us uncomfortable, sometimes even unsafe. And if what we're counting on is to feel loving all of the time in that work, it will not happen. Instead, we have to be loving. We have to practice loving. And this is where West gets it right. Justice has to be what love looks like in public. However imperfect, however partial, however many times we make mistakes, we have to strive for justice. Because we don't just want to feel loving towards other people, we want to be loving towards them. We have to be just in order to be truly loving. because it isn't loving to express love for the world and let its people continue to suffer. To quote West once again, justice is what love looks like in public. May it be so.